Morgenhofen is a shy, overweight 15-year-old whose life feels as heavy as the burden she carries every day. She lives with her father, Robert Hoffen, a lean, arrogant man whose gaunt face and sinewy neck reflect his cold, unyielding demeanor. Robert had always dreamed of a son, a boy he could teach to fix engines, talk about sports, and share beers with on the porch as the sun sank low over the countryside. Instead, he got Morgan, a daughter he never wanted and hardly tolerated. Her mother, Angelica, had once been a fleeting source of warmth in their home, but it was warmth wrapped in chaos. Angelica's beauty was as striking as her flaws. Wild auburn hair, a laugh that could light up a room, and a darkness that never seemed to leave her eyes. She had been as lost as Robert was cruel, their love a toxic storm that left Morgan trapped in the wreckage. Angelica died when Morgan was just 12 years old. Morgan came home from school that day and found her mother's lifeless body slumped in the bathtub, the water murky with spilled pills and beer bottles on the ground. Did she commit suicide, or was it an accident? A story that no one will ever figure out. It was a bitter end to a woman who had spent her life running from herself, from Robert, and from the responsibilities of motherhood. Angelica had numbed her pain with drugs and alcohol, leaving Morgan to fend for herself even when she was alive. Robert, though equally flawed, wore his failures with pride, as if his disdain for responsibility made him more of a man. The death of Angelica didn't break him, it embittered him further. He took custody of Morgan not out of love, but because he viewed her as a burden no one else should have to carry. Women, he believed, were inherently weak, good for nothing but following a man's strict rules. His rules. Their home was a monument to his apathy. A crumbling house surrounded by a graveyard of junk cars, each one overpriced and rusting under the sun. Robert claimed to be fixing them up to sell, but everyone in town knew the truth. No one was buying. It was less about the cars and more about avoiding Morgan, who spent most days ignored or barked at from across the room. For Morgan, life was a constant battle. At school, her classmates tormented her about her weight, her shy demeanor, and her threadbare clothes. At home, her father's disdain cut deeper than any playground insult. She found solace in food, her only comfort in a world that offered little kindness. Her beautiful features, crystalline ocean eyes that shifted color in the sunlight and thick, wavy blonde hair, were hidden behind layers of insecurity and self-doubt. But even under the weight of grief, neglect, and shame, something inside Morgan refused to give up. Beneath her sadness was a flicker of defiance, a quiet but steady resolve to survive in a world that seemed determined to forget her. Morgan Hoffen wasn't just the daughter of two broken people. She was a girl who still had the potential to rise from the ashes of their failures, even if the road ahead was dark and unforgiving. Morgan trudged nearly a mile to the bus stop, the dusty road stretching endlessly before her. Despite her daily trek, her weight remained the same, a stubborn reminder of her struggles. She clutched her worn school binder tightly to her chest, her backpack heavy as if she had rocks inside it, her mind adrift in a haze of thoughts. What will today bring? She wondered, already dreading the answer. To escape her worries, Morgan let her imagination take over. She daydreamed herself into a different world, one where she wasn't an invisible, overweight teenager. She imagined herself gliding across a grand stage, crowned Miss America, a bouquet of roses in her arms, and a dazzling smile that everyone adored. For a fleeting moment she smiled, holding on to the fantasy as if it might carry her through the day. When she finally arrived at the bus stop, the oppressive heat wrapped around her like a suffocating blanket. The sun hung mercilessly in the sky, its rays bouncing off the clay-colored dirt, making the air shimmer with heat. Morgan stood silently, kicking small rocks with the tip of her shoe as the bus lumbered into view. The metallic groan of the doors opening always made her heart sink. She climbed aboard, scanning the rows for an empty seat. She prayed she wouldn't have to share. But as usual, the bus was packed, and the jeers began before she could take her first step down the aisle. "Here comes the earthquake," someone shouted. Laughter erupted, sharp and cruel, echoing off the bus walls. Morgan forced a smile, the kind that said, "You didn't hurt me." But inside, she felt the sting of humiliation creeping in, hot and unrelenting. Her eyes welled up, but she quickly cast them downward, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. As the bus lurched forward, The sudden motion threw her off balance. She stumbled but managed to catch herself before falling. The kids roared with laughter, louder this time, their taunts filling every corner of the bus. "Careful, the Richter scale can't handle you," another voice called out. Her face flushed crimson, a burning mix of embarrassment and anger. The heat of their laughter burned hotter than the sun outside. She hurried down the aisle, making her way to the back of the bus, where the older teens, meaner and louder than the younger kids, were clustered. Just as she was about to sit, a boy stuck his leg out. She didn't see it until it was too late. Morgan tripped, her binder slipping from her grasp as she fell hard onto the grimy floor. The laughter exploded around her, cruel and relentless. Her cheeks flared with heat as she scrambled to her feet, snatching up her binder and sliding into a seat as quickly as she could. The burning embarrassment made her want to disappear, to vanish into thin air and escape their mocking faces. The laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, stretching on like a cruel symphony, until the bus driver's voice crackled over the speaker. "All right, that's enough. Settle down now." The noise died down to a low murmur, but the damage was already done. Morgan stared at her lap, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her binder. She swallowed hard, forcing herself not to cry. The day had barely begun, and already, she felt like it was over. The bus had settled into its usual rhythm, a cacophony of kids shouting, laughing, and arguing. Morgan sat stiffly in her seat, staring out the window, trying to pretend she wasn't there. The sun's glare off the glass made her eyes sting, but she welcomed the distraction. "Hey!" Morgan turned her head slightly, startled by the voice. A emo girl sat across the aisle, her long black hair draped over one shoulder, eyeliner thick and smudged like a shadow around her pale face. She had freckles dusted across her nose and cheeks, an almost innocent contrast to her hardened stare. The girl chewed gum methodically, her eyes fixed on Morgan as though sizing her up. Next to her sat a emo boy, older and sharper looking, his lips curling into a smirk as he glanced at Morgan. He chuckled quietly, a sound laced with mockery. "Shut up," the girl said, smacking him lightly on the chest with the back of her hand. Her smirk lingered as she turned back to Morgan. "What's your name?" Morgan hesitated. The attention made her stomach twist, and she wasn't sure if it was curiosity or cruelty driving the question. "Still," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Morgan." The girl tilted her head, her gum snapping between her teeth. "Morgan, huh? Okay." She leaned toward the boy and whispered something into his ear. His smirk widened, and he tried to suppress a laugh. Morgan's chest tightened. She didn't know what they were saying, but their stifled giggles told her enough. "I'm Z," the girl said, sitting back with a self-assured grin. Morgan blinked. "Z? Really?" The name sounded as if it had been plucked from a bad teen movie. She bit the inside of her cheek, holding back a laugh, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity made it even harder to process. "This is Justin," Z said, gesturing to the boy, who finally let out a chuckle. "Don't tell her my name," Justin muttered, shaking his head as if Morgan wasn't worth knowing it. "Hey, can I ask you something?" Z asked, leaning forward slightly. Her gum-chewing slowed, her tone dripping with fake curiosity. Morgan shifted uncomfortably but nodded. "Sure." Z's lips curled into a smirk. "Is it true you prostitute yourself for money?" The words hit like a slap, and for a moment Morgan couldn't breathe. Her cheeks flushed hot as laughter erupted from Justin beside Z, his head thrown back as though the insult was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Morgan opened her mouth to respond, but her voice caught in her throat. Justin leaned forward, his laughter bubbling over into cruel words. "Is it true you suck your dad's dick for money?" The bus fell into chaos as Justin's laughter roared, Z's eyes widening in shock, then her mouth wide open. Even her gum slipped from her mouth, unnoticed as she slapped Justin's arm, her laughter betraying no regret. Morgan stared out the window, her vision blurring as tears streamed silently down her cheeks. She clenched her binder so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream, to yell at them, but her voice was trapped somewhere deep inside her, suffocated by the weight of their cruelty. The bus kept moving, the laughter fading into the background noise, but Morgan's shame lingered, cutting deeper with every second. The school bus screeched to a halt, and the kids poured out in their usual chaotic rush, their voices a cacophony of teasing and laughter. Morgan stayed put, gripping the cold metal edge of her seat until the last of them had disappeared down the steps. She hated the gauntlet of cruel remarks and sidelong glances, so she always waited until the bus was completely empty. She had no intention of facing Z and Justin, who trailed at the end of the line, as obnoxious as ever. Justin's hands were wrapped around Z's waist, as he gave her a playful slap on her rear end. Morgan couldn't help but notice again that Z's figure was, well, less than impressive. Flat as a board. But that didn't seem to bother Justin. The way he clung to her was suffocating, even to watch. The bus driver, an older man with graying stubble and tired eyes, followed the last student off the bus. Morgan thought she was in the clear. She saw him pull a cigarette from his pocket, lighting it with shaky hands. The glow of the ember was a tiny rebellion. Smoking was strictly forbidden on school grounds, but who was going to stop him? Morgan hesitated in the back seat, watching through the grimy window as he leaned against the side of the bus, the cigarette dangling between his fingers. She sighed and stood, her backpack heavier than usual. The creak of the aisle under her feet made the driver whip around. "Jesus Christ, kid!" He jumped, dropping the cigarette. "You scared the hell out of me." He stomped on the burning stick with a twist of his boot, his face flushed with annoyance. Morgan offered an awkward smile, her voice barely audible. "Sorry about that." She walks out and slipped past him. She headed toward the school doors. The driver glared at her retreating figure, muttering under his breath, "Dumb kid made me waste a perfectly good smoke." He fished another cigarette out of his pocket, shielding it from the breeze as he lit it. The bitter scent curled around him like a secret. From the corner of his eye, he scanned the side windows of the bus, ensuring no other stragglers were lurking in the shadows. It was his routine, his unspoken rule to make sure the bus was empty. Not because he cared, but because mistakes led to questions and questions led to trouble. And trouble was the last thing he needed. Morgan stepped into the school's fluorescent-lit hallway, her stomach already in knots. The laughter of her peers echoed off the walls, a sound that didn't feel like it belonged to her world. She pulled her hood tighter over her head, wishing she could disappear. Somewhere behind her, the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingered, following her like a bad omen. The school's ancient PA system crackled to life, its speakers sputtering out the haunting melody of grandfather's clock. It wasn't a pleasant tune anymore, it dragged with a discordant whine, like a lullaby gone wrong. The eerie chimes signaled that students had exactly 5 minutes to get to their classes, or face the dreaded fate of detention for the remainder of the period. Morgan looked up at the speaker hanging precariously above the hallway. Its casing was stained and flecked with what looked like mold, a relic of the school's perpetually strained budget. It had become a joke among the students, one of those details everyone noticed but no one cared enough to fix. Like most things in this crumbling building, she shuffled into her math class, her head down, and slipped into her usual seat near the back. The chair creaked loudly as she sat, and almost immediately, the boy behind her began his juvenile performance. Each time Morgan leaned forward, he made obnoxious farting sounds, earning snickers from nearby students. She clenched her teeth, but didn't turn around. She'd learned long ago that ignoring it was her best defense. Instead, she opened her notebook and scrawled the subject for today's lesson across the top of the page: math. For most kids, this word spelled doom, but for Morgan, it was one of her rare comforts. Numbers made sense when nothing else did. Mr. Tubley, their math teacher, waddled to the front of the room. His potbelly stretched his shirt, and his suspenders struggled to keep up. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, and his thinning hair seemed perpetually disheveled. He cleared his throat, his voice gruff yet warm. "All right, class," he began, his tone carrying a hint of excitement. "I've got some good news for you all." The room, however, didn't share his enthusiasm. Conversations buzzed unchecked as students laughed, whispered, and passed notes. Morgan glanced at Mr. Tubley, who now had one eyebrow raised in mock annoyance. "Attention!" he bellowed suddenly, his voice booming across the classroom. The kids immediately echoed him in unison, chanting, "Attention," as if on cue. It was a silly tradition he'd started at the beginning of the year, and somehow it worked every time. The room fell silent with all eyes on him. "Thank you," Mr. Tubley said, grinning. He held up a sheet of paper, waving it teasingly. "Now, I've got something special here." Someone in this class has earned a perfect score and perfect attendance this year. The room buzzed with murmurs as students glanced around, trying to guess the recipient. Morgan kept her eyes fixed on her notebook, half listening, until she heard the name. Kenneth, Mr. Tubley announced with a flourish. You've got perfect attendance and are officially Student of the Year. Applause broke out as Kenneth, a scrawny boy with an ever-present grin, stood up and sheepishly waved to the class. He looked like he didn't know whether to be proud or embarrassed. Morgan clapped along with the rest, though her mind drifted. For all her intelligence, for all the hours she spent poring over her homework, she would never be the one standing up there. Perfect attendance was a pipe dream for someone like her, someone who carried invisible battles that even the best grades couldn't fix. As the applause faded, Morgan's gaze shifted to the window. Mr. Tubley's face lit up, his grin wide as he called out, "Morgan!" A single clap echoed awkwardly in the room, quickly fading into silence. Morgan, lost in thought and still staring out the window, didn't register her name. "Morgan!" Mr. Tubley called again, more firmly this time. She blinked, snapping out of her trance, and turned her gaze to him. "Me?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes, you," he replied warmly, holding up another certificate. For a moment Morgan sat frozen. The words hung in the air like a spell she didn't quite believe. But it was true, she had won. She was finally noticed. Slowly, a smile spread across her face, her cheeks warming as she stood and walked toward the front of the classroom. Her smile wavered slightly when she noticed the other kids. No applause. No congratulations. Just blank stares, a few smirks, and a collective indifference that made the room feel heavier with each step she took. The classroom was silent except for the creak of the old floorboards under Morgan's feet, the sound filling the void where celebration should have been. She didn't let it dampen her spirits, though. She clutched her hands tightly together, her smile refusing to falter. When she reached Mr. Tubley, his kind eyes met hers. "Congratulations, Morgan," he said, his voice genuine and proud. "You are a bright young lady and very intelligent." He handed her the certificate with a ceremonious flourish. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice steady despite the lump of emotions building in her throat. She turned back to her seat, holding the certificate like it was the crown from a Miss America pageant. For once she felt special. Important. Seen. As she sat down, her confidence brimming, a familiar noise broke the fragile silence. PFFFFFFTTTTTT. The boy behind her had struck again, his obnoxious fart noise cutting through the air like a cruel punchline. The class erupted into laughter, the sound roaring and bouncing off the walls. Morgan's smile froze, her face hardening into a mask of stone. Chapter 2. What was only a few hours felt like days, but finally, the clock struck noon. It was lunchtime. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the air as students bolted for the cafeteria. Morgan grabbed her things and rushed to the line, her heart racing for reasons no one else seemed to understand. She hated this part of the day, not because she disliked food, but because of what it looked like. Every time she hurried to the cafeteria, it seemed to everyone else that she was desperate to be first because she overate or couldn't wait to stuff her face. The whispered comments, the side glances, the snickers, they clung to her like the grease from the cafeteria trays. But they didn't know the truth. Morgan wasn't rushing for the sake of indulgence. She was rushing because if you weren't near the front, the good food was gone within 10 minutes. It always was. And when that happened, what remained were the leftovers. Cold bread and processed cheese sandwiches, slapped together without care for those who either couldn't afford the day's hot lunch or simply lost the race to the front of the line. Morgan had tasted those sandwiches enough times to know she couldn't do it again. The stale bread, the rubbery cheese that didn't melt, the hollow ache in her stomach even after eating, it wasn't just a meal. It was a humiliation. So she kept her head down and moved quickly, hoping no one would notice or care why she was hurrying. To everyone else it might seem silly, but to her, this was survival. Morgan felt a rare flicker of happiness as she made it to the cafeteria line, just in time to grab today's special lunch, orange chicken and rice. It was her absolute favorite, the small comfort she looked forward to in a day otherwise filled with unease. Balancing her tray, she turned and let her eyes sweep across the chaotic, overcrowded cafeteria. The air buzzed with voices and laughter, plates clattering, and the occasional outburst of mockery from one table or another. Then she saw it, a lone, empty table in the corner. Without hesitation, she rushed toward it, weaving through clusters of kids before anyone else could claim the spot. She slid into the seat, setting her tray down with quiet relief. Morgan preferred it this way. Sitting alone meant avoiding the snide comments and cruel laughter that inevitably came if she dared sit with others. The kids at her school were merciless, always ready with a jab about her weight or some ridiculous rumor they'd conjured up for their own amusement. Not that it mattered, she reminded herself. No one ever tried to sit with her anyway. But truthfully, she didn't mind. The isolation felt like a shield, a safe little corner in a world that seemed determined to push her down. She took a bite of her orange chicken and savored the tangy sweetness. For now, in this moment, she had her favorite meal and her peace, and that was enough. As Morgan finished the last bite of her meal, she thought she felt something light tap the back of her head. She froze for a moment, but decided to ignore it. Probably just my imagination, she told herself. She didn't want to believe anyone was targeting her. Then, boom, another tap. This time she turned around. A group of kids quickly looked away, their faces betraying them with silent giggles and barely concealed smirks. She scanned the floor and saw them, 2 bread rolls lying near her feet. She didn't need to piece it together, it was obvious. They'd been throwing the rolls at her, probably waiting for her to react, to give them the show they craved. Morgan took a steadying breath, her face expressionless, and stood to clear her tray. As she walked past the table of laughing kids, one of them muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "She's probably going to eat those bread rolls." The group erupted into cruel laughter, their voices cutting into her like knives. Morgan's grip on her tray tightened, but she didn't stop. She didn't give them the satisfaction of turning around or defending herself. Instead, she walked straight past them, her face a mask of indifference. Once her tray was in the bin, she made a beeline for the bathroom. Her heart was pounding now, her chest tight. She shoved the door open and locked herself in a stall, sinking onto the closed lid of the toilet. There, in the quiet solitude of the bathroom, she let herself feel it, the sting of humiliation, the anger, the sadness. She stared down at her hands, trembling slightly, and clenched them into fists. "They don't matter," she repeated to herself, though the words felt hollow. Her eyes stung, but she refused to cry. Not here. Not where they could ever find out. Morgan sat silently in the stall, her feet pressed against the closed lid of the toilet. The bathroom door creaked open, and the sound of laughter and chatter filled the small space. A group of girls had entered, their voices echoing as they headed straight to the mirrors. Morgan held her breath, pulling her feet closer to her chest, hoping they wouldn't notice her. She listened as they applied their makeup, the rhythmic clatter of compacts and brushes punctuating their conversation. "Did you see her outfit today? Like, what even is that?" One of them snorted. "And Mr. Harris is so hot. He's got that whole broody teacher vibe," another giggled. Their words bounced off the tiled walls, shallow and mean-spirited. Morgan tuned them out as best as she could, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, they finally left in a rush, their laughter fading down the hallway. Morgan exhaled, her chest heaving as she tried to steady her nerves. But just as she thought she was alone again, the door opened once more. This time, it was a boy and a girl, their voices hushed and full of mischief. Morgan froze, her body stiffening as she heard their footsteps shuffle across the floor. The boy's sneakers squeaked as he walked back and forth, his shadow passing beneath the stalls. Morgan quickly lifted her feet again, tucking them out of sight. "There's no one here," the boy whispered. "Good," the girl replied, her voice dripping with playful seduction. Morgan's stomach churned as the unmistakable sound of kissing filled the air. It was wet and loud, their lips smacking together without care. She pressed her hands over her ears, her face burning with embarrassment. "I gotta go," the boy said suddenly, breaking away. "No, don't go," the girl protested, but he was already gone, his hurried footsteps echoing as he dashed out of the bathroom. Morgan dared to exhale, but before she could relax, the girl wandered over to the mirror, fixing her hair and muttering something under her breath. Then it happened. Morgan's feet, cramped from holding their awkward position, slipped and hit the stall door with a dull thud. The girl whipped around, her voice sharp and accusatory. "What the fuck? Who's in here?" Morgan's heart stopped. She hesitated for a moment, but there was no use hiding now. Slowly, she unlocked the stall door and stepped out, her face flushed with humiliation. The girl stood frozen, her eyes narrowing as they locked onto Morgan's. It was Z. Z's eyes flared as she stormed toward Morgan, her voice sharp and accusing. "Were you spying on us?" Morgan backed up instinctively, her hands raised defensively. "No, I swear. I wasn't." Z stepped closer, her tone dropping into something far more threatening. "Listen to me, you fat fuck. If you tell anyone about Mr. Harris and me, I'll beat the life out of you. You hear me?" Morgan's breath caught in her throat. Her mind reeled, trying to process what she had just heard. "Mr. Harris?" she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. It all clicked into place. The boy the man who had been here earlier. His voice had been deeper than the other kids, but not so much that she immediately noticed. Now it was obvious. He wasn't a student at all. Morgan stared at Z, her shock evident. Z mistook the look for defiance and grabbed her by the collar of her shirt, pulling her close. "Say anything, and I'll make sure you regret it for the rest of your pathetic life." Morgan swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She nodded quickly, her words stumbling out in a rush. "I won't say anything, I promise. I swear." Z released her with a sharp shove, glaring as if daring her to lie. Without another word, she stormed out of the bathroom, leaving Morgan trembling and alone. Morgan stood there for a long moment, trying to catch her breath, her mind swirling with questions and dread. A teacher. Z was fooling around with a teacher. And now Morgan knew a secret she never wanted to keep. Morgan watched Z storm out of the bathroom, leaving her alone once again. She let out a nervous chuckle, her lips curling into a small, disbelieving smile. "Mr. Harris. Wow!" The absurdity of it all clung to her like static. She took a deep breath, shook her head, and left the bathroom, heading toward recess as the lunch period ended. The schoolyard was alive with the chaotic sounds of kids laughing, shouting, and running. Morgan made her way toward an empty swing set, the rusty chains creaking softly as the breeze pushed them. She chose a seat and didn't swing, instead sitting still, her hands loosely gripping the cold chains as she stared out at the sea of children playing. The swing felt like a metaphor for her life, isolated, unmoving, and out of sync with everyone else. It wasn't the first time she felt this way, and it likely wouldn't be the last. She sighed deeply, boredom and loneliness coiling tightly around her chest. In the far corner of the playground, she spotted Z and Justin huddled together under a tree. They looked like the perfect couple, laughing and holding on to each other as if the world revolved around them. Morgan's gaze lingered too long, her curiosity getting the better of her. Suddenly, Justin's head turned toward her. Even from the distance, she could see his hand motioning toward her, pointing as he whispered something to Z. Panic jolted through Morgan. She immediately dropped her eyes to the ground, hoping she hadn't been caught staring. It was too late. Z was already walking toward her, her stride confident and deliberate. Morgan stiffened, gripping the swing's chain tighter. Z slid into the swing beside her, the motion sending a faint creak through the metal. "Hey," Z said casually, her eyes fixed on Justin in the distance, as if she wasn't really talking to Morgan at all. Morgan didn't respond, unsure of what Z wanted, but knowing it couldn't be good. "Don't tell Justin about what you saw earlier, okay?" Z said, her tone sharp yet somehow casual. Morgan nodded quickly, her stomach nodding. "Good," Z said, her voice softening slightly as she continued. "I love Justin, okay? I don't want you telling him. It'd break his heart. He doesn't deserve that." Morgan nodded again, her lips pressed tightly together. Z's tone shifted, becoming oddly confessional. "I've just been feeling off lately, you know? I missed my period, and I think I might be pregnant. But the thing is..." She hesitated, then continued in a whisper. "I don't even know whose it is." Morgan's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. She stared at Z, struggling to process the information. Why was she telling her this? It wasn't like they were friends. And hadn't the secret about Mr. Harris been more than enough for one day? Z leaned closer, her voice dropping into a warning. "Don't think I won't hurt you if you tell anyone." Morgan leaned back against the chain of the swing, her voice steady and low. "I said I won't. And honestly, I don't care." Z narrowed her eyes, her irritation flickering briefly. She seemed to thrive on attention, and Morgan's indifference didn't sit well with her. But she shrugged it off, standing up and brushing invisible dust off her skirt. "Good," Z said flatly before striding away, back to where Justin was waiting under the tree. Morgan watched her go, the playground's chaos suddenly feeling even louder. The weight of Z's secrets pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. She glanced down at her hands, still gripping the swing chains, and exhaled slowly. As she watched Z walk back to Justin, her hand slipping into his as if nothing was wrong. It made her stomach churn. Z was cheating on Justin, and he didn't have a clue. Justin seemed far too innocent to deserve something like this. He wasn't perfect, sure, but he wasn't the type to play games or hurt anyone. Morgan sighed, the faint creak of the swing grounding her as her thoughts spiraled. Justin had only fallen into this so-called emo phase because of Z. She'd transformed him into a shadow of himself, someone pretending to be something he wasn't. Morgan scoffed quietly. They were both posers. Morgan hated people like that, those who dressed in all black, painted on eyeliner, and strutted around as if they owned sadness itself. To her, they didn't understand what being emo truly meant. It wasn't a costume or an aesthetic. It wasn't about dark clothes or loud proclamations of despair. Real emos didn't need the world to know they were hurting. Real emos didn't crave attention or validation. They stayed hidden, drifting silently through life, avoiding everything and everyone. Real emos were invisible. Like her. That's what made her different. She didn't need an audience for her sadness. Her world was quiet, isolated, and lonely. But at least it was genuine. She looked out at Justin one last time, sitting under the tree with Z. His head tilted toward her as Z whispered something in his ear, making him laugh softly. They could live their fake lives all they wanted. Morgan had her own battles to fight. And unlike them, she fought hers alone. The school day finally ended, but it felt like the same monotonous routine, day after day. How could kids not get tired of the constant bullying, Morgan thought. Earthquack! The same kid from earlier shouted, mocking her. Morgan ignored it and made her way to the back of the bus, where Z and Justin always sat. She had a quiet, almost empty seat in the emo group, even if she didn't fit their costume aesthetic. She was one of them in spirit, but she never had to advertise it. Z and Justin were already seated, and Z shot her a side eye, barely turning her head. She was visibly tense, like she was afraid Morgan might spill her secrets. Morgan didn't care. It wasn't her business, anyway. Beast. Beast! Justin chanted, laughing afterward as he looked to Z, waiting for her to join in. But Z didn't laugh. Instead, she looked away, her face tight with some unknown worry. Stop, she snapped at him. Justin blinked, clearly confused. Huh? What's wrong? Z shifted uncomfortably. I'm on my period, okay? She muttered, almost in a whisper. Morgan couldn't help but wonder, was Z lying to Justin, after she had just confessed to missing her period earlier? Or was it just another way for Z to avoid talking to her? Z definitely seemed paranoid. Justin, oblivious to the tension, shrugged and put in his headphones, retreating into his music for the rest of the ride. Morgan just stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. She didn't really care about Z's drama or her lies. What bothered her more was how fake everything felt, like everyone was putting on a show for attention, constantly hiding behind masks of their own making. The bus slowed to a crawl, then came to a full stop at Morgan's drop-off. She stood up and walked down the aisle, but as she passed, she saw a kid eyeing her with the intent to trip her. She quickly adjusted her stride, stepping right over his foot. The kid stared, disappointed at losing the opportunity to see her fall. Instead, the other kids booed her. Morgan didn't acknowledge them. She simply stepped off the bus and began the half-mile walk home. When she arrived, the house was just as she'd left it, messy and chaotic. The kitchen sink was flooded with dirty dishes, and empty beer bottles were scattered throughout the living room. Her father lay snoring on the couch, a baseball game playing in the background, his cap pulled low over his face. He was definitely drunk again. Morgan sighed, shaking her head, and made her way to the computer. She logged into Facebook, a space where she didn't expect much from. She had only 4 friends, none of them being her father. Most were random accounts she accepted just to fill the empty friend list. They weren't real people, mostly bots, but it wasn't like she used Facebook to connect with anyone. She used it to stay in the loop, to keep tabs on her school, the drama circulating, and the gossip she could barely escape. Nothing about Z yet. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, tempted to post about what she had seen, to spill Z's secret anonymously. But she knew better. Z would know it was her. It was always the same with people like her. No one could ever keep secrets for long. She scrolled down, seeing almost all the kids from the bus, their faces plastered on their own Facebook profiles. No one at school knew about Morgan's account. She'd made sure of it. Her profile picture was just a cute image of kittens, and her name was changed to her middle name, Pam, so no one would recognize her. There were no friends on her page, no posts, nothing that would give away her true identity. It was a silent, secret place where she could watch the chaos unfold without being a part of it. Morgan wished she had at least one best friend to spill all the secrets swirling around the school, someone who could understand, or at least pretend to. But she couldn't. She had no one. Suddenly, her father's voice broke the silence with a sharp gasp, followed by a cough. He slowly sat up, blinking groggily, and fixed his bleary gaze on Morgan sitting at the computer. "You're just gonna sit there and be a lazy fat ass, or are you gonna clean the damn house?" His voice was slurred, tired, and angry all at once. He leaned back into the couch and adjusted his hat, pulling it back down over his eyes, signaling the end of the conversation. Morgan said nothing. She knew this routine all too well: drink, sleep, insult, then sleep again. It was the same cycle, and she was used to it. She had no energy left to fight back. She simply stared at the screen, pretending to care about the posts on Facebook, while inside, she just wanted to scream. Morgan shut the computer off and sighed, reluctantly getting up to clean the dishes and scattered beer bottles around the house. She didn't do it often, only when it became overwhelming, or when her father's mess started to take over. It was a task she hated, but someone had to do it. Once the house was somewhat livable again, she retreated to the back of the house and stepped into the shower. The hot water poured down, a reminder of the endless summer heat in Texas, which seemed to cling to the air no matter the season. People loved steamy showers, but Morgan hated it. It made her feel trapped, the heat pressing in on her, and cold water was never an option, not in their old, run-down house where the plumbing barely worked. After the shower, Morgan combed through her hair, then stood in front of the mirror. She stared at herself, hating what she saw, overweight, unattractive. She felt ugly, worthless, like she was suffocating in her own skin. She turned the mirror away, unable to face herself any longer, and crawled into bed. Her bedroom wasn't much. It was a cramped, makeshift closet her father had built after they moved into this tiny, one-bedroom house. It barely fit her bed, but it was the only space she could call her own, even if it was little more than a corner. Morgan turned on the TV, her eyes immediately drawn to the familiar VHS tapes of Miss America she had watched 100 times before. The same routines, the same pageantry. It never got old. She would pretend she was one of them, graceful, poised, beautiful. She would reenact the beauty queen gestures, imagining herself on that stage, smiling with confidence, dreaming of a life beyond the dirty dishes and cluttered house. A small smile crept onto her face as she allowed herself to imagine a life she could never have, at least not here. Morgan reached under her bed, her fingers brushing against the familiar cardboard box of zebra cakes. Pulling it out, she opened the box and unwrapped one of the sweet treats, sinking her teeth into the soft, sugary layers. The first bite was a balm to her frazzled nerves, easing her stress as if each morsel dissolved a piece of her anxiety. She chewed slowly, savoring the moment until, for a fleeting second, she forgot where she was. Without hesitation, she reached for another. The rhythmic unwrapping and eating became almost hypnotic, a trance that dulled the noise of the outside world. It was nearly 5 p.m. by the time she tore through the last wrapper. With a sigh, she gathered the crumpled boxes and wrappers, shoving them deep into the recesses of her closet, out of sight and out of mind. In the kitchen, the sound of heavy chopping broke the quiet. Morgan stepped into the doorway to find her father bent over the counter, his broad shoulders hunched as he worked a butcher knife through a slab of raw meat. The shape of it struck her as odd, unfamiliar. "What is that?" Morgan asked, her tone laced with curiosity. He didn't look up, his hands steady as he sliced the meat into even chunks. "It's dinner," he replied flatly. Morgan rolled her eyes. "Obviously. What kind of meat?" she pressed, knowing full well he understood her question. For a moment he didn't answer, his focus entirely on his work. Then finally he said, "Rabbit." Her eyebrows shot up. "Oh," she exclaimed, the surprise clear in her voice. She wasn't put off by it. Meat was meat, after all. She wouldn't touch rats, bats, or cats, but rabbit? That didn't seem so bad. She'd never had it before, but the idea intrigued her. "Is it good?" she asked, curious. He chuckled, the sound low and rough. "Of course it's good. Why else would I be cooking it?" Satisfied for now, Morgan slid into a chair at the small wooden table, watching as her father stepped out to the backyard. The smell of charcoal smoke wafted through the air as he flipped open the grill lid and tossed the seasoned meat onto the hot grates. With a practiced hand, he closed the lid and reached into his pocket for a crumpled pack of 305s. He lit a cigarette and took a deep drag, his gaze settling on the sprawling junkyard that was their backyard. Rusted cars piled on top of one another, tools scattered in disarray, and half-finished projects forgotten in the haze of time. Morgan watched him from the sliding glass door. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he grunted in frustration at the chaos that surrounded him. The yard wasn't as bad as some of those reality shows on TV, but it was close enough to remind her of an episode of Hoarders. Her father stood there, cigarette smoke curling around him, staring at the mess as if it were taunting him. Life here wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And tonight, she ate rabbit for the first time. "How was it?" her father asked, his voice steady but probing as he leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Morgan had only managed to eat half of the rabbit. The richness of the meat didn't sit well after gorging on zebra cakes earlier. She swallowed a bite and covered her mouth, chewing thoughtfully. "It has an interesting taste," she said finally. "But I like it." Her father raised an eyebrow, his hand clutching the neck of his beer bottle. "Then why aren't you eating it?" he asked, his tone teasing but edged with scrutiny. "I'm not hungry," Morgan replied, setting her fork down and leaning back in her chair. He chuckled, a deep sound that reverberated like a growl. "You're always hungry. What are you talking about?" He punctuated his remark with a swig of his beer, shaking his head in disbelief. Morgan flinched inwardly at his words. They weren't overtly cruel, but they hit a nerve all the same. The way the world commented on her, her appetite, her body, her choices, was a chorus she couldn't escape. Lately, she had been learning to let the words roll off her, but they still stung in the quiet places she didn't talk about. As her father continued to eat and drink, his eyes landed on the trash can. Sticking out of the top was a telltale stack of empty zebra cake boxes. His expression darkened. "Really, Morgan?" he snapped, slamming his beer down onto the table with a force that made her flinch. The glass rattled, and the table quivered under the impact. Morgan didn't meet his gaze, keeping her eyes trained on the half-empty plate in front of her. "I don't want to hear you bitching about how shitty your day was," he continued, his voice rising with each word. "Or how fat you are. You want to know why you're fat? You're the reason." The words sliced through the air like a whip, and Morgan felt their sting. Her father jabbed a finger toward the trash can. "I know you've been eating all those damn zebra cakes. You don't need food, you just crave attention." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor as he grabbed his plate and stormed to the sink. The clatter of the dish hitting the metal basin echoed in the room as he spun on his heel. "Clean this damn house and make yourself useful for once," he growled before disappearing into his bedroom. The slam of the door was a punctuation mark to his fury. Morgan sat in silence, the tension in the room hanging thick as smoke. She felt the tears welling up but forced them back, refusing to give him the satisfaction. Quietly, she stood, carried her plate to the trash, and dumped the untouched food into the bin. Without a word, she trudged down the hall to her room and crawled into bed, pulling the blanket over her head like a shield. Tomorrow was Friday. Friday the 13th. Maybe things would be better then. Maybe. Chapter 5. Painted confidence. Morgan didn't own an alarm clock. The sound was one more thing that irritated her father, and she had learned long ago to avoid waking his wrath. Instead, she relied on her phone's vibrate setting, placing it close enough to hear and feel. When the gentle hum buzzed against her nightstand at 7 a.m., she stirred, groggy but accustomed to the routine. The school bus didn't arrive until 9 a.m., but Morgan always left early. The long walk to the bus stop wasn't optional. She needed the extra time to make it there. She shuffled to the bathroom, brushing her golden blonde hair until it gleamed under the dim light. Today felt different. Maybe it was the heavy weight of yesterday's dinner conversation, Or maybe it was the fact that it was Friday. Whatever the reason, Morgan decided to wear makeup, a rare and daring choice. She reached into her closet and pulled out the old makeup box she had kept since her mother's passing. The lid creaked as she opened it, revealing faded powders and slightly cracked tubes of lipstick, each one a relic of her mother's life. Her hand hovered over a deep red lipstick, its silver cap slightly tarnished. As she uncapped it, she noticed something caught in the tube, a single, delicate strand of her mother's hair. It was long and golden, just like Morgan's. She carefully plucking the strand free before pressing the lipstick to her lips. The creamy texture felt foreign as she smacked her lips together, spreading the color evenly. Next came the eyeliner. She traced it cautiously along her lids, her hand trembling slightly with the unfamiliar motion. A sweep of black eyeshadow followed, its smoky tint darkening her gaze. Finally, she dusted her cheeks with a faint blush, the deep red bringing life to her pale skin. When she looked in the mirror, she hardly recognized herself. The makeup didn't transform her into someone beautiful, not in her eyes. But there was something else there, a glimmer of confidence. It was small, fragile, but it was enough. Morgan dressed quickly, pulling on a pair of jeans and her favorite hoodie. She slung her backpack over one shoulder, tucking the makeup box carefully back into her dresser drawer before stepping quietly into the hallway. Her father's room was silent. She tiptoed through the house, locked the door behind her, and began her walk to the bus stop. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of dew and wet grass. With each step, her boots crunched against the gravel road. She felt the weight of the makeup on her face like a shield, something to keep the world at bay for just a little while. Today was Friday. Maybe, just maybe, it would be a better day. The bus screeched to a halt in front of Morgan, its doors folding open with a mechanical hiss. She climbed the steps slowly, her backpack slung over one shoulder, already bracing herself for the usual noise and chaos. Her only choice, as always, was to sit in the very back. The moment she stepped inside, however, the atmosphere shifted. The raucous chatter of kids dulled to an eerie quiet, and every face turned toward her. Morgan froze mid-step, confused by the sudden attention. The whispers started immediately, soft murmurs traded between cupped hands. Why are they staring? She wondered, her stomach knotting. Was it the makeup? Did they think she looked pretty? The thought gave her a fleeting flicker of hope. She smiled nervously and made her way to the back, but before she could sit down, a boy's voice cut through the silence. "Hey, we got a clown on the bus." The laughter erupted like a bomb, shattering the quiet into chaos. "Earth honk." Morgan's face flushed hot with shame as the mocking voices swirled around her. Kids slapped their knees, pointing and doubling over as if the joke was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. She dropped into her usual seat, head bowed, trying to disappear into herself. She should have known better. Makeup was a terrible idea. She wanted to check her face, to see what they were laughing at, but without a mirror, she'd have to wait until she got to the girls' bathroom to scrub it off. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Z wasn't on the bus today. But Justin was there, sitting by the window with his headphones on. His shoulders were hunched, his face brooding as he stared out at nothing. He looked furious, but there was something else, something sad, in the way his jaw clenched. Before Morgan could dwell on it, the boy in the seat ahead of her whipped around, his brown curls bouncing. He pretended to recoil in horror, gasping dramatically. "Whoa, I didn't know Halloween came early," he exclaimed, shivering theatrically before turning back around with a laugh. Morgan's fists clenched on her lap. His curls were annoyingly perfect, each one springy and neat, like he spent hours making sure his hair looked good. She wanted to punch him, but instead, she glanced down and spotted something on the floor, Z's gum from the day before, still sticking to the grimy bus floor. Carefully, she picked it up. It was dried out, but Morgan leaned down and discreetly spit on it to soften it. The gum turned sticky again, just enough for her plan. When the moment was right, she reached forward and smushed it into the boy's beautiful brown curls, burying it deep. She leaned back immediately, staring out the window as if nothing had happened, but a smirk tugged at her lips. In the corner of her eye, she caught the faint mint-green blob tangled in his hair. "Serves you right," she thought. As the bus neared the school, Morgan stole a glance at Justin. He hadn't moved from his spot, still leaning against the window. She wondered if he and Z had fought. Did Justin find out about Mr. Harris? Or maybe they had broken up. The questions tugged at her, but she knew better than to ask. Justin wasn't the type to spill his feelings. When the bus jerked to a stop, the kids bolted for the door in their usual chaotic rush. Morgan stayed in her seat, waiting for the crowd to clear. It was her routine, her way of avoiding the inevitable jostling and noise. She adjusted her backpack and glanced one last time at the boy with the gum in his hair. He hadn't noticed yet, but she was sure he would. And when he did, it would be the small, quiet revenge that made her day just a little brighter. Morgan hurried off the bus, but for once, she wasn't the last one off. Justin followed closely behind her, his footsteps steady and heavy. She glanced over her shoulder, curious, and stepped aside as he brushed past her without a word. She felt a pang of curiosity, nosiness, really. She wanted to know what was going on. Where was Z? What happened between them? Did they have a fight? Justin's closed-off demeanor only added to the mystery, but Morgan decided not to push it. Only time will tell, she thought, filing the questions away for later. In the girls' bathroom, she carefully washed off her makeup, scrubbing at the blush and lipstick until her face felt bare again. The eyeliner, though, she decided to keep. Staring at her reflection, the dark smudge around her eyes gave her a different look, one that felt a little rebellious. Maybe this was how the emo kids felt, like they were part of something darker, something separate from the rest of the world. Satisfied, Morgan left the bathroom and headed to her favorite class, math. Mr. Tubley was already writing fractions on the board when she walked in, his sharp handwriting angled with precision. "All right, class," he said, turning to face them with marker in hand. "Who can solve this?" The room went silent. Morgan knew he'd be looking at her soon, he always did. Mr. Tubley loved picking her to answer because she was the best student in the class, and he never missed an opportunity to show her off. Sure enough, his eyebrows rose in her direction, his face lighting up with a silent invitation. Morgan stared at her desk, willing herself to disappear. She hated the teasing, the way the other kids whispered and snickered whenever she solved something with ease. When no one else volunteered, Mr. Tubley sighed heavily and turned back to the board. "All right, fine. Here's the answer," he said, his tone tinged with disappointment. Morgan rolled her eyes and went back to doodling in her notebook. Her pen sketched meaningless shapes as her mind drifted back to Z. Where was she? The bell for the next class rang, jolting Morgan out of her thoughts. She stuffed her things into her bag and hurried into the hallway. It was chaos. Kids swarmed the narrow halls, shouting, laughing, bumping into each other. Morgan tried to squeeze through, her focus on getting to science class upstairs before the final bell rang. The warning bell sounded, and the crowd barely moved, and she was stuck, surrounded by kids who didn't seem to care about being late. By the time she reached the staircase, the final bell rang, echoing sharply through the halls. Great, she thought bitterly. She knew what this meant. Ms. Holden, her English teacher, was one of those who locked the door the second the bell rang. She didn't care about excuses, didn't care that the hallways were practically gridlocked on Fridays. Morgan sighed, standing at the foot of the staircase, deciding whether to even bother explaining. Her day slowly getting worse, and it wasn't even lunchtime yet. Morgan trudged upstairs, holding on to a sliver of hope. Maybe Mr. Holden would cut her some slack. After all, it's Friday the 13th. She turned the doorknob, but it was locked. Through the narrow window, she saw him glance up, shake his head, and point dramatically to the end of the hall. Detention. Morgan sighed and muttered under her breath. Of course. She made her way to the detention room, her steps heavy with frustration. When she walked in, she froze. The room was packed, kids were crammed into every seat, their loud chatter and arguments filling the air. Morgan scanned the chaos, feeling out of place. She wasn't a troublemaker. She wasn't like them. But, as Ms. Rules, the substitute detention supervisor, called out to her, there wasn't much she could do. "Hey, new girl. No seats left. You're sitting up here." Morgan blinked. "Up here?" She followed Ms. Rules's finger and realized with horror that she was pointing to the desk right next to hers, at the very front of the room. Morgan would be face to face with every single kid staring back at her. "Come on," Ms. Rules said impatiently, tapping the edge of her desk. Morgan hesitated, but there was no way out. She reluctantly slid into the seat, her eyes glued to the floor. She could already feel the stares of her classmates, but what really made her heart race was the boy sitting at the back of the room, the one she'd smeared gum into earlier. He was looking directly at her. Their eyes met, and she swore he smirked. He gave her a small, knowing nod, like he was silently saying, "I know it was you." Morgan quickly looked away, her cheeks burning. She pretended to focus on the stack of math problems Ms. Rules plopped in front of her. "Here, solve these," Ms. Rules said, her tone flat. Morgan took the papers and dove in. Numbers, fractions, and equations filled the page, and she let herself get lost in the work. Within minutes, she had finished everything. "Already?" Ms. Rules asked, her eyebrows raised. She grabbed Morgan's paper and looked it over. "Huh, you're fast and smart." Morgan gave a polite smile, unsure how to respond. "I'm sorry, but—" Ms. Rules shrugged dramatically. "I have to give you more work. This is detention, not a fun math club." Morgan surprised herself by smiling back. "I love it," she said softly. Ms. Rules chuckled. "Well, aren't you something?" Morgan returned to her work, her confidence growing. For the first time that day, she felt a little pride, like maybe she did belong somewhere after all, even if it was just in her own head. The period was over. Morgan had finished about 5 pages of math and 2 pages of mazes and crossword puzzles, since Miss Holden didn't have any more math to give her. The bell rang for lunch, and all the kids in detention rushed out like animals. Morgan stayed behind, letting the others go first, not caring if she ended up with stale bread and cheap cheese. She felt at peace when the room was empty. "You're not heading out?" Miss Holden asked. Morgan looked at her and replied, "No, I'd rather be here, honestly. Kids are mean." Ms. Holden understood, likely thinking it was because Morgan was overweight and lacked confidence. "Well, I can't have you here. Your time is up. How about I give you a library pass?" she offered. Morgan smiled and accepted it. "Sure, that would be great." Skipping lunch, Morgan headed to the library. Since it was lunchtime, it was nearly empty. She sat down and pulled out the cookies she'd saved from home, eating them discreetly, since no one was allowed to eat or drink in the library. She looked around at the top of the library shelves and read each subject: science, fiction, nonfiction, fantasy. She stood up and browsed some books in the fantasy aisle, thinking, what the heck, why not read and waste some time? She turned and saw another section across from her labeled self-transformation and spiritual. Self-transformation, she thought. Maybe that's what I need. Maybe it talks about losing weight fast or easier. She browsed each book until she reached the spiritual section. At first, she thought it meant self-healing, but as she skimmed the titles, she realized it was about religion and witchcraft. One book caught her eye, its cover dark and metallic, the title written in intricate, swirling letters. She couldn't resist. She opened the spell book and scanned through the contents. It mentioned voodoo, juju, curses, and even sinister animal sacrifices for revenge. This is ridiculous, Morgan thought, chuckling at the absurdity of it all. But still, a part of her was intrigued. She decided, more as a joke than anything, to take it with her. In her rebellious mood, she slipped the book into her bag. It felt liberating, like she was stepping out of her usual, timid self. When school ended for the weekend, Morgan got on the bus, once again hearing the chants of the mean-spirited kids. "Beast! Beast!" they yelled, laughing and pointing as she walked by. She didn't mind it. Her mind was still on the spell book. She thought maybe she could pretend to cast spells on all the kids who bullied her, or even the whole world. When the bus driver dropped her off at her stop, Morgan texted her father, saying she was heading to the park to exercise and lose weight. The last part was a lie. She had no intention of exercising, she just wanted to check out the spell book, knowing her father would hate it. He wasn't religious, but he definitely didn't approve of anything remotely demonic. Morgan made her way to the park, a place she loved for its desolation. It was old, with rusty equipment and overgrown trails. The city either kept it as a historical site or didn't want to spend the money on renovations. Whatever the reason, it suited Morgan just fine. She liked being alone. She ventured deeper into the woods where the swings were, following a trail almost hidden beneath tall, wild grass. Once she found a secluded spot, she sat on the dry sand, opened a pack of nutty bars, and began eating as she flipped through the pages of the spell book. "Which one should I do?" she joked to herself, smirking. She skimmed a spell for good luck. Under a full moon chant, "Lady of Luck, give me your strength and the fortune I desire." She laughed at how ridiculous it sounded but kept reading, her curiosity growing. Then she stumbled upon the revenge section. These spells were darker, involving animal sacrifices. She knew she'd never go that far, but the idea lingered, teasing her curiosity. Could it work? Would it change her life? Morgan looked around, ensuring no one was nearby. She stood, brushing the sand off her clothes, and wandered the empty woods, searching for a lizard. After a few minutes, she found one scuttling under a rock. She caught it and broke some sticks, tying them together with knots made from strands of her own hair. She followed the ritual instructions as precisely as she could. The final step read, "Pour blood onto the sticks and light them on fire while chanting, 'I summon you, my lost friend. I welcome you and you welcome me.'" She hesitated. The instructions called for animal blood. Morgan held the lizard tightly and attempted to cut it with a sharp stick, but it didn't bleed the way she thought it would. Frustrated, she tossed the creature aside. Time was running out, golden hour was approaching, and the spell required the precise lighting of the setting sun. Her heart raced as desperation took over. In a moment of impulsive madness, she reached into her bag and pulled out a pair of scissors. She cut into her own palm, wincing as blood pooled in her hand. She poured it onto the sticks and whispered the chant. The fire sparked to life. The smoke was thick and black, unlike any smoke she'd ever seen. It swirled unnaturally, dense and dark, blotting out the fading sunlight. The wind picked up, howling and colliding against itself, creating a low, eerie whistling noise that sent shivers down her spine. Fear took over. She dropped the book, leaving it behind as she bolted out of the woods, her breath ragged and her bloodied shirt clinging to her chest. The smoke followed her in her mind, and the unnatural wind seemed to whisper her name. She didn't stop running until she reached home, slamming the door behind her and pressing her back against it. For a moment she stood there, panting, and staring at the faint bloodstains on her shirt. The woods were behind her now, but the feeling of wrongness clung to her like a shadow. Did she summon something, or was it all in her head? Was it just her imagination playing tricks, or had something truly eerie happened? Morgan glanced at her phone, but there was still no text from her dad. When she arrived home, she found him sitting in the living room, watching TV and cracking open a beer. He glanced at her, then quickly looked away. But then something caught his eye, her bloody shirt. Morgan had forgotten all about the stain. She turned around, washed her hands with soap, and winced slightly as the water stung the cuts, but she stayed silent. "What in the world happened to you?" her father asked, his voice tinged with concern. "I went jogging and tripped over some glass," she lied, not meeting his gaze. Her father, oblivious, just laughed and turned his attention back to the TV. Morgan felt sick at the sight of her own blood. What had possessed her to do this? She quickly threw her dirty clothes in the washer and took a long shower, washing off the dirt and blood. But even after she was clean, she couldn't shake the feeling of guilt. The image of the poor lizard and her own self-loathing haunted her. She climbed into bed, hoping to sleep it off. But as she drifted into a deep sleep, she had a vivid dream. In the corner of a house stood an overweight girl crying. Morgan approached her, asking, "Are you okay?" The girl turned to face her, and Morgan froze. Her eyes were empty, filled with maggots, and her mouth was missing teeth. "Morgan," the girl whispered, her voice unsettling and distorted. Morgan took a step back, but the girl followed, her voice growing louder. "Morgan," she called, her tone growing deeper. The girl transformed, her body twisting and expanding into something monstrous. "Why did you do this to me, Morgan?" she screamed. Morgan gasped, realization hitting her like a cold wave. The girl, the monster, was her. It was her own twisted reflection. She jolted awake, drenched in sweat, her heart racing. A cold breeze swept through her room, and she swore she heard a soft whisper, calling her name gently. It sounded like her mother's voice. But it had to be a dream, right? Morgan fell back asleep, or maybe she passed out, unable to remember what happened when she woke up. Her mind was foggy, and everything felt distant. As her eyes fluttered open, she looked down at her hand, the memory of the night before slowly creeping back into her mind. The image of the blood, the ritual, the lizard, everything rushed back to her, and she felt a pit in her stomach. She quickly covered her hand with a long bandage and fashioned a makeshift cast with cloth. Trying to ignore the sick feeling in her chest, she pushed herself off the bed and walked to the kitchen. There, she grabbed a bowl from the dirty sink, rinsing it with water just enough to wash off the dried food. Pouring herself some cereal, she added milk, only to realize it was nearly empty. Her father walked in, holding his toolbox, and noticed the empty milk carton. "Did we run out of milk already?" he asked, glancing at her. "Yup," Morgan replied, tossing the carton into the trash. Her father set his toolbox down, grabbed his car keys, and looked at her. "Come on, follow me." Morgan nodded and quickly scooped up a large spoonful of cereal before following him out the door. She climbed into his old truck, still feeling the heavy weight of the night's events on her chest. "You want to drive?" Her father surprised her with the question. Morgan blinked, a little taken aback. "I don't have a license," she reminded him. Her father grinned. "I guess it's your lucky day. Hop in and drive. It's just 2 miles down the street." Excited and nervous at the same time, Morgan climbed into the driver's seat. She put the truck in gear and slowly pressed the gas pedal, her heart racing. "Slow and steady," her father instructed. Morgan had driven before, though not legally. There were times she had to drive her mom home from the bar after a few too many drinks. She was only 10. As she focused on the road, the words "It's your lucky day" echoed in her mind, and she couldn't help but think of the spell she had chanted in the woods, the one for good luck. Was it her lucky day? Or had the spell worked, just like she had hoped? Either way, she didn't care. She was driving, and for once her dad was being nice to her. She could feel the wind through the open window, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to relax, even if just for a moment. They listened to the classic rock station on the old, static-filled speakers, but neither of them minded. The crackling sound seemed to add a nostalgic charm to the moment. As they sang along to the tunes, Morgan couldn't help but notice how happy her father seemed. She had never seen him so carefree, so at ease. Her heart warmed with a love she hadn't felt in years, a love that had been missing for so long. "What's new?" Morgan asked, tapping along to the bead on the side of the truck's roof. Her father bopped his head, smiling. "I made a new friend at work." Morgan felt a flicker of joy for him. Her dad needed a friend, someone to help him feel less isolated. "What's his name?" Her father emphasized the pronoun with a slight grin. "Her name is Leslie." Morgan's smile faded. "Oh!" She felt a pang of sadness, something she hadn't expected. She had always believed that when you were married, you would always love your first love, no matter what. Even until death do you part. She didn't know what to think about Mindy, or the fact that her dad was starting over with someone else. "Maybe you can meet her someday." "Who knows?" he added, trying to reassure her. "Yeah, that would be great." Morgan lied, forcing a smile. They arrived at the store, and Morgan parked the truck on the side of the dirt lot. Her father grabbed the keys as they both got out of the truck. They walked into the store, the bell above the door jingling as they entered. "Hey, Robert. How you doing?" the cashier called out. "I don't know what it is, but man, do I feel great today," Robert said with a grin. Morgan smiled, glad to see her father so upbeat. She walked past the aisles, grabbing the milk and tossing it into the cart. Her eyes lingered on the Twinkies. She hesitated for a moment, then grabbed them too. She couldn't help it, she was excited and a little ashamed, but the excitement won out. She picked up some bread and eggs before moving on. "You think you can get me some pork on Monday?" the clerk asked Robert. Small-town life meant everyone knew each other's business. The clerk knew Robert worked at the slaughterhouse, and he was asking for some fresh meat. "Absolutely. You want a pound?" Robert replied. "Sure," the clerk said, handing him some cash for the pork. As Robert finished up with the clerk, he looked for Morgan. He waved her over, and she joined him at the front. "Here's Morgan," he said proudly, showing her off. "Wow, she's getting bigger," the clerk commented, eyeing Morgan. Morgan smiled, determined not to let the remark bother her. But when her father spoke next, something in his words made her heart swell. "Yeah, she's growing up," Robert said.